Hi,
Hello.
Doug. How are you?
Good. Good to see you. It's so great to continue our conversations about China and U.S.-China relations and all the complexities of things that are going on. Um,
Yes.
for the last several weeks, we've been telegraphing or talking about the fact that President Trump had delayed his trip, but he was going to be showing up in China soon, and now we're on that date. I think the meetings are May 13th and 14th, and so it's it's a serious time and it's a really important time. And so it's good that we get a chance to talk more about what's happening and what we think about it and how it's going to affect both economies and how it's going to affect the world.
Yeah, it's a really important time. I was just reviewing the list of people that are invited to go with President Trump to China, and it's a pretty impressive list of American business folks and representing a lot of the enterprises that drive our economy. And yeah, it's a really important time. What's got your attention about the visit?
Well, I mean, I think that, the key things are the big topics, which are um, Iran and the Strait of Hormuz and the trade relations and then the Taiwan question. And so those are really the things that I spend my time thinking about and trying to imagine what's going to actually happen in these conversations and sort of the difference in posture that I think is emerging. But before we get into that, what jumped out at you? You just mentioned the list of CEOs that are coming with Trump. What names jumped out the most at you?
Yeah, well, the headline, is that Elon Musk, Tim Cook, Larry Fink, and other CEOs, it's sort of like Gilligan's Island and the rest. But it's like who do we have here? We've got Elon Musk, Tim Cook, Larry Fink, Boeing. We've got representatives from like Cargill, Citigroup. It's like a lot of finance folks, a lot of technology folks, and some manufacturing folks. Obviously, we've got Cargill, so that's commodities. So these are all things that are sort of, I think, top of mind and things that drive the economy. But I think it's really interesting, this list and what it might say about the type of conversations that are going to be happening, which I know that we're always sort of wary of China's technology. Maybe we're developing more partnerships. Maybe things are going to get a little easier and more collaborative between the countries. I know that commodities were an important part of the conversation with Canada. So maybe there's something to be said for, having the Cargill folks there. Obviously, I think the financial groups, they have a vested interest in any part of the economy, growing, perhaps specifically technology. I'm not sure. So yeah, just looking at this, I think this does kind of give us an indication of what they're going to talk about. What do you think about my read on that? Is the list kind of, does it portend the agenda?
Yeah, I mean, I think even before, I mean, it's a great analysis that you just gave, but even before we get into the agenda and what it means for the agenda, just the fact that, these CEOs are going together with Trump to China. I mean, we have talked about this before, but, when, I think China was very much looking forward to the trip of the Trump to China on March 30th. And then the Strait of Hormuz and the Iran conflict happened, and he had to delay the trip. And I think people in China, as my sources tell me, that they were very disappointed and sort of really, of course, understand what was getting in the way. But they were really looking forward to continuing this conversation that started in South Korea in September of 2025. And of continuing that discussion. And then, as you'll recall, when Trump didn't show up, Tim Cook went. And that wasn't an ask of the U.S. government. It was just the fact that Tim Cook is very, very committed to China. And you've heard me say this many times, but I'll say it again for our listeners. We're married to China. We are so deeply involved in, small things like the single largest, we're in a trade war, but the single largest exporter from China to the United States is an American company called Walmart. Elon Musk and Tesla has its biggest gigafactory in Shanghai. And the case that I know the best, Apple, because I was sort of on the inside of things for about 5 years from 2014 to 2019. China is the reason that Apple is the most profitable company in the world, or the second most profitable company, I guess, and one of the most valuable companies in the world. Why is China the reason? Because China has just an extensive supply. Apple works with about 1,600 Chinese suppliers. And they have these many industrial clusters that all sort of compete for Apple's attention and are willing to work with Apple for very, very, very low margins, because there's a partnership there. And so like when we think, well, Foxconn has a final assembly plant in Chennai, and so Apple can just make iPhones in India. No, that is not how it works. We are married to China, and it's a deep, deep relationship. And so the fact that, big names like Elon Musk and Tim Cook are going to be accompanying President Trump on this trip suggests to me that that Trump is really kind of thinking deeply about how we need to send the signals that we are partners. And, for me, I'm happy about that because I believe partnership is better than competition and trade wars. And so I think that it's a really kind of significant thing that you mentioned beyond just the big names. But, we also have BlackRock, Larry Fink, and we have Cargill. And, this is a really, really interesting entourage. And it's an interesting list of just how it suggests to me good things that the Trump administration is thinking seriously about partnership and the ways in which we have to send that signal. We need each other. And so I think we'll see how things play out. But again, I'm sort of happy that they're taking that stance. And I think it's a good sign because I think, trade wars are bad and cooperation is good. And so I think that's a powerful thing.
Yeah, I agree. And it does seem, we talk about so often how important relationships are, not just governmental relationships, but, business relationships. And within the business relationships, there's, all of the different ways that, people, companies, governments are interlocked. And I think this is a really smart, wise thing to do is when, maybe government to government hasn't been going all that well. We're going to have to ask China for some help. But, really driving home the point that these relationships are very important, how enmeshed we are as economies, and how I think what you've said, that G2 comment is that, yeah, we're the two most important economies. We really should be recognizing that and linking together. And I think this is a really, really interesting time, and I can't wait to see what happens.
Yeah, me too. I'm excited. So it's going to be intense. So what other things jump out at you? Did you think that of the three things that I think are really important, and I think are going to be on the agenda? Of course, we have Iran and the Strait of Hormuz. And then we have just the trade war issues and the question of whether or not we're just going to sort of back down on tariffs. And then we have the Taiwan question, which is a big question.
Yeah, the Taiwan question is huge. And I'm not quite, as versed in that as I'd like to be to speak intelligently about it. But I think that, all of this is really interesting because I think I think the United States is in a less powerful position than we would have been had we met earlier. And at this point, I think, the United States economy continues, public perception, continues to just be shaky. And, we're feeling uncertain. Our leadership demonstrates a lot of, mind changing and flip flopping. We've had the Supreme Court, strike down the tariff. So Trump is going into this meeting having had his hand slapped by his own government saying, no, you can't do that. And then meanwhile, we've started this conflict in Iran, and it's not going as well as the United States thought maybe it would. And perhaps we're losing confidence, and perhaps we need China to participate a little bit more. So we're kind of going into this situation, I think, from a weaker position than we would have been had we gone it previously. And maybe that's why we're bringing all of these business folks because, oh, by the way, remember how important we are to your economy. But, I'm curious what you think. I mean, obviously, I think we need some help getting out of the Iran situation. No more lives need to be lost, and we need to get the economies going. These oil prices are really difficult for American and Chinese citizens alike. So what are your thoughts on that?
Well, just to work through each of these. Let's leave the Taiwan question for last, and just kind of deal with the trade issues first. So just the trade issue, going back to, the tariff approach to things started in the first Trump administration, and it wasn't nearly as outlandish as it is today, but it was, Trump has this basic idea. And just to remind our listeners what the point of tariffs are set up so that you make things more expensive at the border such that you raise prices, and then people are incentivized to buy American and to buy things that are made in America so that you create jobs in the manufacturing sector. The problem with that is you need a manufacturing supply chain to be able to create those goods, right? And so if we look at, there's interesting, the two comparison cases here. If you look at Tesla, that case, actually, there is some logic to it because Tesla actually does have a vertically integrated manufacturing supply chain here in the United States, in addition to the manufacturing supply chain in China. But it actually does have the situation where if you raise prices at the border such that BYD automobiles become more expensive at the border, then people might be incentivized to spend more money and buy a Tesla and therefore support jobs in the United States. So the logic actually works with the case of Tesla. The logic does not work with organizations like Apple, because as I just mentioned a few minutes ago, Apple works with 1,600 Chinese suppliers, and they are built around these industrial clusters that produce the components, modules, and final assembly for iPhones and tabs and Apple computers. And so, the idea that you would raise prices at the border such that iPhones coming from China are more expensive, you're just going to be passing those costs on to consumers. I mean, there is no logic of how you're going to just magically make iPhones in America because the manufacturing supply chains don't exist here, and it would take decades to build them. And so, I've long said and long been just critic of the whole trade war tariff approach. It became much, much more extreme in January of 2025 when President Trump took office in his second term. And it just seemed like a disaster to me. Now, as we have discussed, it looked like things were maybe lightening up a little bit, in September of 2025. And to your point, Trump has had his hand slapped by his own court system. I mean, it's made it clear that the aggression that's being played out here in the trade war approach is very problematic. That being said, there still needs to be deeper negotiation between the two parties, right? We've got to come to terms with the idea because we both need each other. And if we're, again, putting tariffs on things like iPhones, we're also putting tariffs on things like light industry goods that Walmart sells. And so those costs all just get passed to consumers. And so, I'm just hoping that the Trump administration starts to bring a little sanity to the situation, and we look at this as a deep partnership where we are deeply connected to each other. The trade imbalance of China versus the world is the highest it's ever been. And the United States is one of the key buyers of Chinese goods. And so again, all of those costs get passed to consumers. And this is not a good time, especially with the things going on with the Strait of Hormuz and oil prices. This is not a good time to be passing on costs to U.S. consumers. It's a painful time economically for everybody. So my hope is that sanity will come in and they will just be better. Like they'll be more cooperative and really kind of think of ourselves as trade partners, not trade enemies.
And speaking of the trade imbalance, do you think that, what does the U.S. have to export to China? And do you think that there's going to be, more imports of American goods, by the Chinese government and Chinese businesses?
Well, so it's a great question. And this is where I do think that, the list of CEOs is not just, Tim Cook and Elon Musk. It's also people in finance and BlackRock. And, now that being said, even with the case of the two CEOs that we just named, China's a big market for both of those products as well. I mean, iPhones are sold in China and they're, sort of very popular items with Chinese citizens. And there is competition there because of Huawei and a couple of others. But we are still, China is a big customer of what it is that we are making as well. And so there is that balance issue, right? And again, to the extent that we become more and more enemies through the trade war, it doesn't just raise prices for U.S. customers, but it kind of downplays Chinese people's desire for those U.S. goods that have a big market in China. And so I think that's an issue. But then, again, to get beyond the products, the places where the U.S. also has tremendous influence is in finance and accounting and in consulting and, a variety of different places where the U.S. I mean, if you think about the U.S. economy, this is, again, one of the things that's, I think, confusing to people is, when we talk about the problems of the U.S. economy, and just the decimation of the manufacturing sector, here again, I like to remind people that, China didn't steal our manufacturing jobs. We invited our manufacturing companies to go global and go to places like China. I mean, this was Milton Friedman and Ronald Reagan in 1980. And the basic idea was, if we can get cheaper labor, then we're going to raise shareholder value, for shareholders, right? And so more profits mean higher shareholder value, and, it's going to make everybody happy. Now, then when I'm very critical of that approach to things, I think it's confusing sometimes because the U.S. is the largest economy in the world. And so, well, Doug, if you think the manufacturing economy is so bad, like, how are we the largest economy in the world? And we're the largest economy in the world because of our power in white collar industry jobs, right? So investment banking, law, accounting, finance. And what we've seen over the last 45 years is the largest shift of resources and income from the middle class and working class to the top 5% of American society. So we still have a very large economy and we still have very powerful industries, but all of those resources have gone into the white collar industry jobs for the most part, with the exception of high tech and AI. And so we have, so those are the two places where the United States still is a great leader in the development of these industries. And China needs us, right? Just the same way we need China in terms of our manufacturing supply chain and their sort of industrial clusters that they've built that make Apple and Tesla such powerful and profitable companies. But China needs us. Like they need us in these higher industry goods. And again, this is mostly white collar industry goods, but there is the AI and high tech that we are leaders in the world on. And so, I think that's where the balance is going to come, and China will continue to want to buy our goods like iPhones and iPads and Apple computers and hopefully Teslas. And I mean, Tesla is not doing so well against BYD these days, but, we are leaders in AI, and AI is becoming a really powerful space. Now, one of the things, just as a reminder though, our approach to AI is a little bit different than China's approach to AI. China does have its own indigenous technology in this space, in DeepSeek. It's not sort of a friendly, chatty AI kind of personality. It's very much focused on building strong, efficient manufacturing supply chains. So it's a really interesting time. So anyway, I do think that there's stuff that China needs from us, but we just have to continue to collaborate and cooperate. Two largest economies in the world.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And I think that, I know we've got more to talk about with President Trump's visit, but I think just zooming out, looking at, the shift from, China as a place to manufacture cheap goods to, what's happening now, whereas, China is a partner. We need to have conversations. We need to build a future together. I think this really is, a great highlight for the work you do, where it's embedded folks that are in China that have relationships that are embedded there. We've got the cultural fluency of our team. You're looking at the economy from, as we talk about, the boots on the ground standpoint. So I think if there ever was a time to need a shepherd, folks who are wanting to do business in China, like, this is the time. It's so much more complex and nuanced than perhaps ever before. So I think this is a really great time to be, somebody with your knowledge and expertise on the team, on our weekly calls. I just see it, the interest and passion for understanding what's happening. And I think, people just need that shepherd, that guide, that person who can really just share that cultural and political understanding. I think it's more important now than ever.
Well, thank you for that. And I'm, I've been a China watcher and a China analyst, for all of my adult life and for the last 30 years or so. And yeah, like, these are really complex times. When I teach my China classes at the Thunderbird School of Global Management at Arizona State University, what I always like to remind students of is, like, yes, you come to business school, you come to management school, and we're going to get you the skills about accounting and finance and leadership. But history and culture matter. And if you're going to be an effective leader in any place like China, you need to have a really kind of deep understanding of the history and culture and local politics. And just to give, again, the example that I know the best, shortly before I left my deanship to join Apple in China, Xi Jinping came to power. He was inaugurated on March 13th, 2013. And on March 14th, every day is something called Consumer Day. And they call out a company that they want to just say, you're not behaving the way we want you to. And that day was Apple. And so I was just watching this from Washington, D.C., where I was the dean of the business school at George Washington University. And I was like, oh my goodness, this is trouble. Because, if you remember, China entered the World Trade Organization in 2001. And it became illegal to have a quid pro quo for market access, which meant that they couldn't, if you want to do business there, you couldn't demand that you have a joint venture. And so you have to see a big shift from what we call fixed asset investment to just paying labor costs, right? And of course, our friend Tim Cook entered China in 2001, right after China entered the World Trade Organization. And for a decade or more, it was a very, very laissez-faire economy. It was very open under Hu Jintao and Wen Jiabao. And then Xi Jinping came to power in 2013, and it just changed dramatically. And this is where, to your point, this is where you need people to kind of help navigate the difficulties of the politics. And one of the really fun things that we did when I was working with Apple, and this is actually written about in Patrick McGee's book, Apple in China. So I think I can talk about it. But, it really required that we sort of build relationships and kind of rebuild our government friendships, right? And, I happen to have worked with and know Justin Lin, who had returned to China and became Xi Jinping's main economic advisor. But we needed to do better at telling the story of Apple in China, because Tim Cook is a very smart business person. But the reason Apple suppliers are willing to work with Apple for zero margins, they won't work for free, but they'll work for cost and take very little in the way of margins. And the reason is because Tim had a very strong approach to being an operations expert himself, to embedding Apple operations managers into the Chinese factories so that they could help teach the factories how to be more efficient and be better. And then those factories would work for Apple for zero margins or 1% margin, and then they would turn around and use the same efficiency to go make their money from Huawei, Oppo, Vivo, Samsung, everybody else. And so it was a very powerful thing. But the thing that we had to help Apple executives do, and I had to play a role in this too, in helping Apple navigate China, was to convince the Chinese government about how important this relationship and investment was. And they were learning from Apple, and we had to make clear that they were learning. And the great thing that happened during that time was, Apple spent about $55 billion a year in China on labor. And that's, the single largest spend of any foreign company operating in China. But that 55 billion was viewed as labor costs, right? Not fixed asset investment. But what we did was we convinced the Chinese government that because we were embedding operations managers in factories and teaching the factories how to build effective manufacturing supply chains, that they would count our labor costs as fixed asset investment. And then suddenly Apple became the single largest investor in China in the world. Patrick McGee compares this to the Marshall Plan and, huge investment in companies. I don't know if I would go that far as, comparing this to state-led investments in building countries, but it is really important. And so sorry for the long-winded answer, but to go back to your point, this is a really important time for all of us who are helping companies, but also countries like the United States, navigate China. And, and it's important right now, so important that we are approaching this in ways that we're building partnerships. We are treating Xi Jinping like a partner and treating him with respect, and, and then going from there.
Yeah, I think, the relationships are absolutely, and I think that's something of the Trump visit that is very much right out in the open and on the table, is how important these relationships are. So yeah, I like the entourage. I think last week, I'm not sure if it made it into the podcast, but I may have said something about a clown car arriving and how many people are getting out of the clown car. And I think it's maybe a little bit more sophisticated of a vehicle this time. Perhaps it's a limo arriving. These are a lot of dignified folks who are showing up. So yeah, I'm excited to see what happens. But I'm also really, how does Taiwan factor into this? Because, the U.S. is, we've indicated, the Trump administration is, authorizing selling $11 billion of arms to Taiwan. And obviously that would be a threat to China's view that Taiwan is part of China. It speaks to the United States' view that Taiwan is independent. So this is a very contentious issue that I don't think there's a lot of room for negotiating on. How will that impact these conversations?
Well, it's a great question, Aubrey. And, again, when I say strong things like we are married to China, Apple and Tesla and Walmart are, fundamentally embedded in we have to be with China. There are also strong points of view in my mind that, this is a non-negotiable issue. Taiwan is a part of China. And if there was a move and support for Taiwan independence, it would be a disaster. There will be a conflict over this, in my estimation. Now, one of the things, again, I like to always do with my students is just to remind them a little bit of the complexity in the history here. And so, Taiwan has a very complex history that goes back, 100 years in terms of what this conflict has been about. And so, you have to kind of think through what, the difficulty that China faced first with the first Opium War, then the second Opium War, then the Sino-Japanese War, and then the fall of Imperial China and the warlord period. It was a very, very difficult time. And then, you have World War II, and then you have the Communist Revolution, right? And in the Communist Revolution, you have the nationalists fighting the communists, right? And the nationalists were supported by the United States, and this was Chiang Kai-shek's nationalist army, and they lost. They lost to Mao Zedong and the communists. And then they, exited and went to a little island called Taiwan. And Taiwan, by the way, just again, to go back to the sort of Sino-Japanese War and the, those periods, I mean, Taiwan has a complex history because it was occupied by Japan for many decades before Japan lost World War II. And so then when then when the nationalists lost to the communists, then they went to Taiwan, there was a very strange period in global political economy history, because the nationalists were occupying a little island of 19 million people, but they were claiming to still be, the leaders of China, and the world sort of accepted that because up until about 1972 or 73, Taiwan occupied China's seat on the UN Security Council, and so it's a messy history, right? But eventually, when, Nixon, we remember Nixon for Watergate, but like I like to remember Nixon because he was actually a person who really sort of opened the door to negotiations with China, and he went to visit Mao Zedong in 72 or 73. And then we agreed that China should actually occupy the UN Security Council seat, not Taiwan. But anyway, so the point is that there's this very complex history with Taiwan, but when Deng Xiaoping came to visit Jimmy Carter in 1979, and we agreed that our economies should be collaborating and cooperating, we also agreed that there is one China and Taiwan is a part of China. That was the agreement that goes back that far. That was reaffirmed in the 90s under the Clinton administration. It was also a part of China's eventual entry into the World Trade Organization. And so this has been a long history. Now, one of the things that's interesting about U.S. being a democracy, and, we have separation of the three levels of government, the executive branch, the congressional branch, and the judicial branch. After Jimmy Carter affirmed that Taiwan was a part of China and there was one China, the U.S. Congress passed something called the Taiwan Relations Act, where we started selling arms to Taiwan. And so that might seem crazy because didn't the president just say that Taiwan's a part of China? So why are we selling arms to Taiwan? But, with our separation of powers, if it is a veto-proof congressional movement, you can't do anything about it, right? Because and that's what they had. And so anyway, the Taiwan Relations Act has been a complex part of that. That being said, as we developed economically, it became very clear that, we're all integrated economically, and we can't be having a war over, Taiwan independence, including Taiwan, because Taiwan was very deeply embedded in China as well. And so companies like TSMC, which is a very important semiconductor manufacturer, and now the single largest investor in the state of Arizona. But, everybody saw just how integrated, and it's not just TSMC. I mean, Foxconn is a Taiwanese company, and Foxconn is deeply embedded in China, and they make the final assembly of iPhones. And, there's a bunch of these integrations. And so I think that we've kind of, just agreed and believed that that, we have to continue on in cooperation and not have this conflict. That being said, things did have become a little complex with Taiwan dating back a couple of decades, because after the nationalists were really about reunification. But after they lost the election, and I guess it was teens to the Democratic Progressive Party, the DPP was much more aggressively oriented towards language around things like independence. And so currently DPP is the leading party in Taiwan politics, but we also have the nationalists. And recently we saw the leader of the nationalist party go visit Beijing. And so again, I think this is a complex issue, and I'm sorry for my long-winded answer, but I like to just emphasize to people like how complex the history is. And we need to understand the complexity of the history and how important one unified China is to China, right? And so what scares me about this is when people don't understand the danger here, and they think, well, if Taiwan wants to be independent, let them be independent, and we'll sell arms to Taiwan, and it'll be, this is not going to go down well. There will be a conflict over this, and I don't want to see that. And so my hope is that, I know this will be on the agenda for the Trump Xi Jinping meeting, but my hope is that, again, Trump will be listening and will understand how important this collaboration and cooperation is, and we will kind of continue to support the idea of the one China policy. And that's my hope.
What else has caught your eye, either in the news this week or about Trump's visit?
Well, I mean, we've talked about trade, and we've talked about Taiwan, and we've talked a little bit about the Iran conflict and the Strait of Hormuz. But I think the other thing that's going to be really interesting in this visit is here again, really treating Xi Jinping and China as partners. And I think, this is the kind of thing when you have the two largest economies in the world and two very powerful economies and two very powerful militaries. My sources in China tell me that, not only were people upset because the Israeli U.S. bombing of Iran came as a surprise to everybody, and it, delayed the Trump visit and the Trump collaborative. But, I know that people in China that are pretty high up, wish they would have had a heads up about this. They wish they would have been briefed or told or asked about what was going to happen. And, China depends heavily on the flow of oil and natural gas through that strait. And so, it's difficult for the economy, although I always like to remind people that while China is heavily dependent on oil coming out of Iran and through the Strait of Hormuz, China's also done much better than the United States over the last 30 years of renewable energy and kind of weaning itself off of, China is the single largest builder and user of solar panels in the world. And, their electric vehicle industry is tremendous. And, so it's an interesting, China is certainly being hurt by the situation in Iran, but it's also, I think, it kind of positioned itself to be ready for any kind of transitions that have to happen. That being said, here again, I'm sure and I know that Chairman Xi wants to be treated as, a leader of the G2, like one of the most powerful nations and economies in the world, and he wants. So I think that, if the situation in Iran, to me, doesn't seem to be going as well as Trump thought it would. And my guess is that China probably can help in sort of negotiating with Iran to open the Strait of Hormuz, and we can hopefully get out of this very tense and difficult situation. So I think that's the other thing that's going to be on the agenda is how well we can navigate this this very difficult crisis-oriented time. So
yeah. And I think maybe this is a, kind of a good opportunity to transition to talking about the 15th five-year plan, if you're ready for that. It seems, there's a lot that's part of the plan, but I think continuing the energy independence and the self-sufficiency to, become less reliant on foreign sources of energy. I think this, it's part of the plan. So I think this is an important time, and seems like China's, kind of on the right track to protecting themselves for the long haul. And again, this is, the 15th five-year plan. We've seen that transition from, China as strictly manufacturing economy, perhaps in our view, maybe even in their view, very very poor as a country. And then looking at where they are now, where they are going to be the most powerful economy in the world. And it doesn't happen by accident. So maybe let's talk about that, the article that we will be posting shortly about how to read the 15th five-year plan.
Sure. Yeah. And thanks for calling that out. As you know, this is going to be our fifth article in a series on the 15th five-year plan. And, this is a really, really important moment. I mean, it's a really important time because, as you and I have discussed before, China has these five-year plans, and they're not just these heavy directives from Beijing because they've created a culture of local governments as industrial firms. And so, but they set the priorities, right? And the priorities in this plan are about, energy independence and really kind of creating the best market for things like electric vehicles and a number of other things. And then those things trickle down to the innovative local governments that really kind of take these priorities and build on them. The one thing that we also wrote about and talked about in one of these articles was that, this isn't just about China creating independence from the rest of the world, right? We see a reopening of the conversations of foreign joint venture universities and how important it is for Chinese universities to be really effective in teaching about, engineering and AI and a variety of other areas that are really high priorities for China to develop. And so my hope, and being a professor myself and a professor at a place called Arizona State University in the Thunderbird School of Global Management, my hope is that this balance between, creating sort of energy independence and, dominant manufacturing areas and kind of key new products, but also creates collaboration and coordination. And I hope that continues and we push that. You and I have talked about this before, but I think the way the United States has treated companies like Huawei is not just horrible, but it's stupid, because what it does is it creates incentives for them to just go and be independent. And, when you have either customers or competitors, you do much better in knowing what they're doing if you're doing business with them. But if they're totally isolated and they're off doing their own innovation, they're going to surprise you. And so anyway, to answer your question, I think the 15th five-year plan is it's a really powerful moment. And this particular one, I've been studying China a long time, but, and so I've seen a lot of these five-year plans, but this one really feels quite significant to me. Like, it really feels like it's sort of the capstone of Chairman Xi's, really. And to your point, I mean, the OGL prediction is that China is going to become the largest economy in the world in about 7 years. And we're pretty sure, that GDP growth is going to continue at a pace of about 4.5 to 5%. And the United States is going to continue at its, 2 to 2.5%. And, if you just do the numbers and draw the lines, like, China becomes the largest economy in the world in about 7 years. And that's a powerful position to be in. So it's a really interesting time.
Yeah, it's very powerful. So what stands out to you, I guess, from when the 15th five-year plan came out to maybe you've had, more time to review and chat with the team? What do you think are the most important parts for American businesses or any foreign company that wants to do business in China? How do we suggest, business folks are, reading this plan, and what should they be looking at, and how should they be perhaps tweaking their approach or perhaps their messaging or their thought process of how do you get started in China?
Well, so it's a great question. And I've sort of given the answer at two levels. The first is just sort of what the nuts and bolts of the plan are, and sort of what industries are being emphasized and what things are kind of creating opportunities, but also creating challenges within the market. And so, for example, we've talked about Tesla and electric vehicles, and we've talked about BYD before. I think it's very stupid that senators in the United States are writing to the president telling him that companies like BYD should not be allowed to sell in America or manufacture in America. But we are going to see continued competition in these spaces, and we're going to continue to see economic development in AI and in important areas about energy and energy independence and renewable energy. And so those things are all important. But the added layer that's really important here is, and I would say this to any company that would listen to me, or any university, like my own university, or anybody, is that the real opportunities here are, again, for negotiation, collaboration, coordination, cooperation. And, again, the two largest economies in the world, we should all be working together. And, if we're just competing and throwing tariffs into the mix, that's not helpful to anybody. And so I really believe that, again, the 15th five-year plan, that, we have these plans every 5 years because they're 5-year plans, but it's really, I think, useful for corporate leaders or university leaders or politicians even to be reading what the priorities are for the Chinese government and be thinking through the ways in which these plans do come from the central government, but they then trickle down into a very entrepreneurial area of these local governments as industrial firms. So it's a powerful balance, if you will.
Yeah. Well, I can't wait to see what happens in the short term over the next few days, and looking towards the long term. I think I think China is slowly and steadily going towards that prediction of becoming the most powerful economy. And it simply is because of this excellent planning and, ability to look ahead and ability to enact the plans, because of the coordination that the government has. And for the good and the bad of it, it really is building a very strong economy in a place that is ripe for opportunity. And I love the collaborative part. I think that really is important in my own, small way as a leader. I find that I get so much more done collaborating and partnering than I would acting independently. And I can't wait to see what happens.
Yeah, it's a really, I've talked before about, socialist market economy and just a very powerful system. And, words like communism don't really have much relevance here because, and also have to be careful not to use words like capitalism too much, but having a very powerful mix of planning and entrepreneurialism and kind of creating the incentives for local governments to really become powerful players and to become very deeply involved in the global political economy is a very, very interesting lesson. And so it's an interesting and exciting time because of what's happening in the Middle East, but it's an interesting and exciting time. So I love this conversation and thank you for listening and talking with me, but I'm very excited about the next 2 days, like seeing what happens. May 13th, 14th, 15th is going to be intense. And so we'll be talking to our audience next week when we're summarizing what we saw. So,
well, I'll see you on the other side of that, and hopefully we'll have some more interesting insights and things to chat about.
Can't wait. I look forward to it, Aubrey.